For 3 generations, my family had preserved its history in the attic of the old house on Lantern Hill. As a child, I watched my grandmother tend to the collection like a gardener among root-bound plants, boxes of yellowed letters, ledgers bound in cracked leather, stacks of photographs showing stern faces frozen in expressions of unblinking vigilance. She called it the archive, and she made it clear that stewardship was a sacred inheritance, passed from one hand to the next without hesitation or release. When she died, the duty fell to me. I was 32, an antiquarian by trade, and the attic became my domain. After my grandmother's death, the attic transformed from a shadowed repository of childhood fascination into the nucleus of my existence. She had passed quietly in the winter, leaving no will beyond a single handwritten codicil naming me as the successor to her responsibilities. "The archive is yours now," her executor had said, handing me a ring of keys as if passing a ceremonial torch. There was no debate, no distribution of her possessions among other relatives. The contents of the attic, every box, every bundle, every brittle sheet of paper, were understood to be indivisible, bound inseparably to the house itself. My father, her only surviving child, had died a decade earlier, and my cousins, scattered across distant states, professed no interest in the dusty labor of preservation. So it fell to me, the one who had always lingered longest among the stacks, tracing faded signatures with my fingertips. I moved into the house shortly thereafter, relinquishing an apartment in the city that had never felt like home. The attic consumed me with the methodical inevitability of a tide. It was a labyrinth of warped wooden shelves and sagging beams, the air thick with the scent of disintegrating paper and the faint, underlying reek of damp wool. Hundreds of containers waited to be inventoried, crates stuffed with correspondence tied in fraying ribbons, steel filing cabinets swollen with tax records and property deeds, and endless rows of photograph albums whose thick black pages held sepia portraits pinned beneath strips of translucent tape. There were ledgers, too, their spines cracked like fault lines, recording births, marriages, and burials with a precision that bordered on compulsion. Every item had been arranged according to a system that was both rigid and inscrutable, its logic discernible only in fragments, alphabetical runs interrupted without explanation, dates presented in reverse chronological order, certain boxes grouped together in shadowed corners as if sequestered by decree. For months, I labored in solitude, surrounded by the accumulated weight of a century. I wore a miner's lamp strapped to my forehead, its pale beam carving islands of clarity from the gloom, and proceeded with the care of an excavator sifting a fragile stratum. I unfolded letters whose ink had bled into indecipherable smears, transcribed genealogical charts marred by water stains, and catalogued tintypes depicting faces so rigidly composed they seemed less like people than effigies. My grandmother's influence was evident in every choice, blank leaves inserted between fragile documents to prevent adhesion, sheets of acid-free paper laid over photographs to ward off the slow creep of emulsion damage, handwritten indices tucked into the lids of crates like protective talismans. She had not merely preserved these materials, she had cultivated them, pruning and reinforcing as if the archive were a living entity that required vigilant tending to maintain its form. Yet for all its order, the collection resisted complete comprehension. Patterns emerged and then dissolved without resolution, multiple copies of the same document, dated years apart, differing only in the smallest details, photographs depicting gatherings where the same individuals appeared in subtly incongruent positions, as though captured across separate exposures, ledgers containing entries that contradicted one another in their tallies of family members present at a given event. I devised my own supplementary system to impose clarity, cross-reference catalogues, numbered storage crates, a master chronology plotted on rolls of butcher paper that draped the attic floor like the hides of some vanquished beast. Still, certain elements eluded even this effort. Dominating the farthest corner, half obscured by a collapsed shelving unit, stood a trunk that defied incorporation into any rational scheme. It was larger than the others, constructed of oak reinforced with iron bands, its surface shrouded in layers of oiled canvas that had fused into a single impermeable skin. The lid was secured not only by a padlock of considerable vintage but also by hasps fastened with broad-headed carriage bolts, as though someone had sought to entomb its contents beyond the reach of ordinary intrusion. Protruding from the canvas, nailed directly into the wood, was a small rectangle of heavy cardstock bearing my grandmother's unmistakable script. The words were penned in India ink, the letters precise and unyielding. "This box remains closed until the last of the signed have departed the earth." To open it before is to invite dissolution. The declaration arrested me each time I approached that corner of the attic. Dissolution, or of what, precisely, remained unclear. The trunk's isolation suggested it held materials of exceptional fragility, perhaps documents too brittle to survive handling, or records whose premature exposure might unravel some carefully maintained historical continuity. Yet its fortification seemed disproportionate to such mundane concerns. I circled it repeatedly during those initial years, shifting surrounding crates to clear space, brushing away decades of undisturbed dust, but never once touched the bolts or tested the lock. The prohibition, though lacking explicit legal force, carried the weight of tradition, embedded in the very structure of the archive. My grandmother had curated every other item with relentless thoroughness, yet she had left this one vessel untouched, its contents held in deliberate abeyance. Stewardship, I understood, required not merely the preservation of what was accessible but the scrupulous honoring of what had been deliberately withheld. And so the trunk remained, a black monolith amid the sprawl of the collection, its silence exerting a gravity that shaped every subsequent act of cataloguing. Aunt Clara's death came without preamble, as if she had been waiting for some internal signal to extinguish herself. She was 89, the last surviving sibling of her generation, and had not set foot beyond the iron gate at the foot of Lantern Hill in nearly half a century. The housekeeper found her in the late afternoon, seated in a threadbare wing chair in the parlor that overlooked the orchard. Her eyes were open, fixed on the crooked silhouette of the largest apple tree, its branches barren and twisted against a sky the color of tarnished pewter. There was no sign of illness or struggle, she appeared merely to have arrived at the end of a vigil that had defined the final decades of her life. With her passing, the condition inscribed on the trunk's note was irrevocably fulfilled. The last of the signed had departed the earth. I retrieved the key from my grandmother's writing desk, where it had lain coiled inside a small brass lockbox, its presence known but never acknowledged during the years of my stewardship. The key was old, its barrel warped by time and disuse, and it took repeated attempts to persuade the lock into submission. The hasps yielded more readily, their bolts withdrawing with a low groan that reverberated through the floorboards, and when the lid finally lifted, the trapped air escaped in a dry, bitter exhalation that tasted of rust and sealed paper. The trunk's interior was partitioned into compartments lined with baize cloth, now mottled with mildew, each section packed with materials arranged with a precision that bordered on mania. There were stacks of correspondence bound in bundles with silk ribbons long since turned to powder, packets of yellowed legal documents sealed with wafers of red wax, and a series of ledger books encased in fitted wooden frames to prevent their spines from warping. At the center of the uppermost compartment rested a single volume, larger than the rest, its black calfskin cover unmarked save for 3 words stamped in faded gilt, the compact. I carried the ledger to the attic sole table, a scarred oak slab positioned beneath the building's only window, and began to read by the weak light that filtered through grimed panes. The opening pages formed a roster of names, every individual who had borne the family surname since the acquisition of the Lantern Hill property in 1823. Beside each entry appeared a date, a signature, and a brief notation in a cipher consisting of 9 repeating symbols. The subsequent pages elaborated in plain, unembellished prose, revealing the compact not as a dry instrument of property or inheritance, but as a deliberate and irrevocable pact, undertaken in the autumn of 1823 by the family's progenitor, Elias Warriner. Elias had been a man of middling fortune, a merchant who had purchased the hilltop house and its surrounding acreage at an improbably low price following the sudden and total abandonment of its previous occupants. What followed was a series of clandestine agreements, sworn by Elias and ratified in turn by every subsequent generation, binding the family to a set of prohibitions and obligations that defied rational explanation. The compact's primary stricture was absolute. No member of the signed lineage was to disclose, to any person outside the immediate family, the true nature of the house on Lantern Hill. The text enumerated a series of ritual acts, annual gatherings conducted in the root cellar at the winter solstice, the maintenance of specific boundary markers embedded in the foundation walls, the exclusion of all unrelated individuals from the property after sunset, and framed these requirements as essential to the preservation of an unspecified continuance. The language was formal and devoid of embellishment, yet it conveyed an undercurrent of coercion that grew more pronounced with each page. Signatories were compelled, through a mechanism described only as the certainty of consequence, to ensure that every subsequent generation accepted the obligations of the compact. Failure to do so, whether through willful disclosure or neglect of the prescribed rites, would result in a dissolution that the text characterized as both personal and irrevocable, the severing of the individual from the familial continuum, rendering them as though they had never existed within its bounds. As I turned the densely inscribed pages, the surrounding contents of the trunk began to resolve into a supporting apparatus for the ledger's claims. Cross-reference documents, private memoranda, sworn attestations, and inventories of ceremonial objects filled out the framework of the compact, detailing the mechanisms by which its strictures had been enforced. What had appeared, during years of cataloguing the broader archive, as mere idiosyncrasies of family behavior now aligned into a coherent, if incomprehensible, pattern. The isolation of certain relatives, the meticulous falsification of departure records for those who had left and never returned, the unwavering refusal to entertain outsiders beyond the garden gate, all were revealed as deliberate acts in service of an unspoken fidelity. The act of opening the trunk had not merely exposed a collection of documents, it had initiated a sequence for which no provision had been made in the years of dutiful restraint. The compact's text made no allowance for the consequences of its own examination. It existed in a state of enforced latency, its prohibitions operative only so long as its contents remained sequestered. Now, with the seal broken and its pages spread beneath my hands, the archive's deeper structure asserted itself with the inexorable clarity of a mechanism completing its appointed function. As the days bled into weeks, the contents of the ledger reshaped the familiar contours of the archive, exposing fault lines that had lain concealed within the ordered expanse of documents and photographs. What had once seemed a chronicle of ordinary triumphs and tragedies, marriages contracted, heirs delivered, kin interred, began to fracture under the pressure of corroborating evidence drawn from the trunk's supporting materials. The discrepancies accumulated with the quiet persistence of water wearing through stone, each discovery undermining the reliability of the records that had defined my years of stewardship. In the ledgers of births and baptisms, multiple entries for the same individual appeared, separated by spans of 20 or 30 years, bearing identical names, dates of birth, and parental lineage. These were not errors of transcription, nor were they the result of twins or cousins sharing nomenclature, accompanying affidavits, sworn before justices of the peace who themselves bore the family name, explicitly attested to the continuity of the named person, as if time itself had been persuaded to halt. Photographs provided further evidence of this suspension. Within a single album, spanning the years 1852 to 1894, the same three men appeared in dozens of images, seated at banquet tables, posed before the east-facing chimney, standing sentinel among the orchard's skeletal trees. Their faces, narrow, with deep-set eyes and mouths drawn into identical lines of restraint, betrayed no incremental decay. Clothing and surroundings changed, as did the faces of those surrounding them, but the three remained unaltered, fixed in a state of perpetual middle age. Private journals, retrieved from the trunk's lower compartments and written in the hand of Elias Warrener's eldest son, offered a rationale for these anomalies that defied any conventional understanding of mortality. The entries described a binding that extended beyond legal or social obligation, a compulsion woven into the fabric of perception and volition. Those who had affixed their signatures to the compact, whether in infancy through a proxy or in adulthood through deliberate ceremony, experienced an increasing resistance to leaving the bounds of the property. The sensation was likened to an elastic cord, tightening incrementally with every step taken beyond the outermost stone walls. At first, it manifested as a vague disquiet, a reluctance that could be overcome with effort. In time, it grew into an intolerable pressure, physical nausea, disorientation, a fracturing of the sense of self, until departure became not merely undesirable but functionally impossible. Those who resisted, the journals recorded, either returned within days, their absence stricken from all family correspondence as though it had never occurred, or vanished entirely, their names and images excised from the archive with methodical precision. The falsifications were comprehensive and dispassionate. Departure records, meticulously drafted by successive archivists, detailed journeys undertaken by the errant, voyages to distant ports, relocations to neighboring states, complete with forged itineraries, purchased testimonials from unrelated parties, and posthumous obituaries placing their deaths in remote locales. Yet the private documents, shielded within the trunk, told a different story. Letters recovered from the trunks of returned individuals, written in trembling script during their periods of exile, described a hollowness that no distance could assuage, memories unraveling like frayed rope, the faces of spouses and children fading into indistinction, the conviction growing that their existence beyond the hill was a fiction imposed by their own desperation. One such epistle, penned by a great-uncle who had fled during the cholera years, concluded with a single line: "The world outside remembers only what we permit it to remember, and permits us to remember nothing at all." These revelations permeated the archive's broader collection, transforming isolated curiosities into fragments of a unified design. The persistent seclusion of certain family members, rationalized as eccentricity or infirmity, aligned with the documented compulsion. The absence of wills disposing property beyond the estate, the unbroken chain of residency spanning 2 centuries, the reluctance to entertain visitors after dusk, all cohered into a pattern of containment. Even the physical structure of the house seemed complicit: doors that resisted opening when certain conditions were unmet, staircases where the sensation of descent faltered midway, windows whose latches engaged with a finality that bordered on deliberation. With each cross-referenced discovery, the archive ceased to function as a passive repository and revealed itself as an active instrument of suppression. The public records, those disseminated to the county clerk, the Vital Statistics Bureau, the Historical Society, formed a seamless membrane of veracity, impenetrable to external scrutiny. Beneath this surface lay a parallel archive, contained almost entirely within the trunk, that preserved the unaltered truth, a lineage whose members were held in perpetual durance, their lives and death subordinated to the necessity of maintaining unbroken occupancy. The implications of this duality extended inward, toward the very substance of identity. If the documents could not be trusted to delineate the boundaries between presence and absence, between the living and the irrevocably departed, then the foundation upon which every subsequent record rested, every photograph, every diary entry, every genealogical table, dissolved into uncertainty. The archive, in preserving its secrets with such ruthless fidelity, had ensured that no clear demarcation existed between the documented past and the inescapable present. The process of reconciling the trunk's revelations with the broader archive reached a point of inescapable convergence when I located my own name within the ledger of the compact. It appeared on a page dated to the 3rd week of my birth, entered in the same meticulous hand that had chronicled every prior signatory. The notation was unambiguous: my initials, followed by the date of my delivery, the names of my parents, and the ciphered mark indicating that my ratification had been performed in absentia by my grandmother, acting as proxy. Beneath this entry lay a brief clause, set apart from the surrounding text: the archivist is appointed successor in perpetuity, bound to the continuance as the vessel of its preservation. The implication settled over me with the weight of a physical object, transforming the role I had assumed as an act of dutiful inheritance into a mechanism from which no disentanglement was possible. As I continued to examine the documents that substantiated this designation, letters of instruction addressed to successive archivists, ceremonial protocols specifying the responsibilities of the appointed successor, the boundary between external observation and personal implication began to erode. The compulsion described in the journals, that invisible tether which restrained the sign from straying beyond the property's perimeter, manifested within me not as a barrier to departure but as an intrusion upon the continuity of my own consciousness. It began with fleeting dislocations, the sudden, unbidden recollection of events that occupied no place in my own memory. I would be sorting a bundle of correspondence from the 1870s and find myself, without transition, standing in the root cellar during a winter solstice gale, the air heavy with the scent of turned earth and burning pitch, my hands other than my own, arranging a circle of iron tokens along the foundation stones. The sensations carried a vividness that surpassed imagination, the cold of the packed soil leaching through boot leather, the pressure of breath constrained by a high-starched collar, the certainty that failure to complete the rite would result in a rupturing of the structure that sustained not merely the house but the very sequence of days it contained. These episodes increased in frequency and duration, each intrusion leaving behind a residue of disorientation, as though a foreign order of experience had been incompletely withdrawn. I began to recognize patterns within the memories, the same faces, the same gestures, the same unyielding adherence to a regimen of containment. A woman with my own profile, dressed in the fashions of the 1920s, standing at the attic window and marking the position of the setting sun against a calibrated frame. A man whose voice echoed in my throat as he drafted the falsified records of a cousin's departure, the words flowing with a fluency that bypassed deliberation. Each fragment bore the indelible conviction of first-hand occurrence, yet none aligned with the chronology of my own life. They belong to the lineage of archivists who had preceded me, their accumulated tenure compressed into a single, unrelenting present. The compulsion to remain within the house deepened in tandem with these visitations. What had once been a voluntary seclusion, a practical necessity for the uninterrupted labor of cataloguing, resolved into an imperative of increasing insistence. Attempts to leave the property, even brief excursions to the mailbox at the base of the hill or the nearest provisioner, were met with a mounting physical revulsion, a tightening across the chest, a dissolution of spatial awareness that left the intervening distance unbridgeable, as though the intervening space had been withdrawn from accessibility. Returning within the boundary walls brought immediate cessation, accompanied by a sense of restoration that was both profound and abhorrent. The journals had described this phenomenon with clinical detachment, but its lived reality carried an inescapable intimacy. The house did not merely contain, it imposed its own internal geography, within which volition was subordinated to the requirements of occupancy. The documents made clear that this binding was not a passive consequence of age or habit, but an active condition of succession. Every archivist, upon assuming the role, became the focal point of the compact's mechanism, the designated point of convergence for the obligations that had been distributed across the broader lineage. The memories, the restraint, the erosion of any distinction between personal recollection and inherited experience, all served to ensure that the successor did not merely maintain the archive but became its continuation, a living conduit through which the preservation of the family's sequestered reality was enacted. The trunk's contents, once opened, had transferred their function from latency to operation, drawing the appointed individual into a state of unbroken custodianship. The past embedded within the documents was no longer confined to paper and emulsion, it extended outward, overwriting the boundaries of isolated identity and establishing, through the mechanisms of memory and compulsion, a continuity that permitted no external vantage or release. The final compartment of the trunk, concealed beneath a false bottom secured by recessed latches, yielded only after repeated attempts to disengage its corroded mechanism. When it finally released, the compartment revealed a narrow space lined with polished walnut, containing a single item wrapped in a shroud of unbleached muslin, a rectangular mirror, its surface framed in blackened bronze and measuring precisely the dimensions of a human face. Accompanying the object was a sealed envelope, its flap secured with a blob of black wax bearing the 9-symbol cipher that recurred throughout the ledger. Inside the envelope lay a single sheet of vellum, inscribed with a directive in the same methodical script that had authored the compact: "Look into the glass and behold the truth of your station." Only in this confrontation is the obligation made complete. The weight of the mirror in my hands conveyed an unnatural density, as though the object contained more than its visible substance. Its surface, though pristine beneath a faint patina of age, resisted casual reflection. Held at an angle, it returned only a subdued, shadowed rendition of the room, the details of surrounding objects muted and indistinct. Compelled by the explicitness of the instruction, I positioned myself before the attic's largest window, where the unrelenting midday light fell without refraction, and raised the mirror to my face. The image that emerged did not conform to the expectations of simple reflection. At first, the surface held my own features, 34 years of wear, the pallor induced by months of confinement, the habitual tightening of flesh around the eyes. But as the light struck the glass fully, the reflection began to change. The boundaries of my face did not dissolve so much as accumulate additional strata. Beneath the visible surface, faintly superimposed, appeared another visage, identical in structure yet marked by the severity of a different era. Hair parted at the center and slicked flat, a beard trimmed to a precise wedge, the skin bearing the stipple of early photographic emulsion. This second image did not obscure the first, rather, it adhered to it, revealing itself as a foundational layer that my own countenance had been laid over, like paint applied to an underlying canvas. Further scrutiny brought successive revelations. Each sustained gaze drew forth additional faces, each conforming to the same physiognomy yet differentiated by the indelible signatures of their respective decades, a fringe of mutton chops framing a face untouched by dissolution, a woman's features bound by the severe knot of a Gibson girl coiffure, her jaw set in the same unyielding line, a younger man with the hollow cheeks of wartime privation, his eyes carrying the same depth of embedded vigilance. The mirror held not a solitary reflection but a composite, an unbroken palimpsest of every individual who had occupied the role of archivist since the compact's inception. These were not apparitions or spectral overlays, they manifested as the inherent content of the glass, as though the reflective surface had been prepared to retain and display the totality of those who had stood before it, their images fused into a single, irreducible whole. The implications of this confrontation permeated beyond the visual. The faces were not merely preserved likenesses, they exerted a palpable presence, each contributing fragments of sensation that aligned seamlessly with the intrusive memories that had plagued the preceding weeks. The compulsion to remain within the property sharpened into crystalline focus, no longer a diffuse restraint but a condition of absolute indivisibility. The mirror made explicit what the documents had only implied: the archive's function was not to memorialize a lineage that had passed but to perpetuate a singular, continuous custodianship, embodied successively in each appointed successor. Those who bore the obligation were not discrete individuals bound by hereditary duty, they constituted a single extended identity, a mechanism of self-renewal wherein each archivist became both successor and continuation, subsuming the qualities of all who had preceded them. This layered reflection established that the family's history, its records, its enforced silences, its compulsive patterns of containment, was not a collection of discrete events but a self-sustaining process, engineered to preclude any terminal point. The house, the documents, the rites performed within its walls, all operated to preserve an unbroken chain of occupancy, ensuring that the designated vessel of preservation could never be vacated. The mirror served as the instrument of this realization, compelling the viewer to recognize themselves not as an isolated endpoint but as the current visible surface of an enduring composite, perpetually renewed and inescapably bound to the obligations that had shaped its constituent layers. With this confrontation, the distinction between preserving the archive and being preserved within it collapsed entirely. The reflection revealed a truth that transcended the separation of past and present: the archive did not merely document the lives of its stewards, it contained and perpetuated them as a single, indivisible entity, admitting no possibility of external vantage, succession without subsumption, or release from the continuum it had been constructed to eternally maintain.